The CEO lifted a glass of champagne in a packed Manhattan restaurant when the waitress leaned close and whispered, "Don't drink that." Nathan Brooks frowned, ready to dismiss her, until a man at the next table suddenly collapsed, his glass shattering across the marble floor. Silence swallowed the room. Nathan slowly lowered his drink as security rushed in. Minutes later, a bodyguard tested the champagne and turned pale. "Sir, this glass was poisoned." Nathan stared at the quiet waitress who had already stepped back into the crowd. "How did you know?" She paused, eyes calm. "Because the men planning it were sitting 10 feet away." What Nathan discovered about her next changed everything. Sometimes the quietest warning is the one that saves a life. The restaurant glittered with soft golden light, and the low murmur of Manhattan's elite finishing late dinners after long boardroom battles. Crystal glasses clinked gently, servers moved like shadows between tables, and the scent of expensive wine and seared steak hung in the air. At the center of it all sat Nathan Brooks, the 38-year-old CEO whose company had just crossed a $10 billion valuation that morning. He barely noticed the celebration happening around him. His focus was on the champagne in front of him, the pale gold liquid catching reflections from the chandelier above. Nathan lifted the glass slowly, glancing at his watch out of habit. Every minute of his life was scheduled, every decision calculated. That discipline had turned a small startup into one of the fastest-growing tech firms in America. Across the dining room, a waitress moved quietly between tables carrying a polished silver tray. Her name was Claire Bennett, though almost no one in the room knew it. To the wealthy clients filling the restaurant, she was simply part of the background, another uniform blending into the rhythm of service. But Claire noticed things most people missed. The way conversations changed tone. The way people watched each other when they thought no one was looking. The way a single sentence, spoken in the wrong language at the wrong moment, could mean far more than it sounded. As she passed the table beside Nathan's, a fragment of conversation drifted through the air. Not English. Not Spanish. Something else. Claire's hand tightened slightly around the tray as she recognized the words. She didn't stop walking. Waitresses who stopped walking attracted attention. But her mind replayed the sentence again, slowly, carefully, translating each piece. 5 minutes. The drink. That name. Nathan Brooks. Her eyes moved across the dining room without turning her head. 2 men in tailored suits sat at a nearby table. They looked like investors or consultants, the kind of people who blended perfectly into Manhattan restaurants where deals were signed over dessert and espresso. One of them checked his phone. The other glanced toward Nathan's table for less than a second. Most people would have missed it. Claire didn't. Nathan raised the champagne glass higher now, the rim inches from his lips. Around him, the restaurant carried on normally. Someone laughed at a joke near the bar. A server set down a plate of grilled salmon at the next table. Nothing felt unusual. Nothing felt dangerous. Which was exactly why Claire knew something was wrong. She stepped closer to Nathan's table, moving like any server doing a routine check on a guest. Nathan barely noticed her until she leaned slightly toward him. Her voice was quiet, calm, barely louder than the hum of conversation around them. "Don't drink that." Nathan froze, the glass still hovering near his mouth. For a moment he simply stared at her, unsure if he had heard correctly. Waitresses did not interrupt CEOs during dinner. Waitresses definitely did not tell them what not to drink. But Claire's expression didn't carry panic or hesitation, only certainty. And for the first time that evening, Nathan Brooks slowly lowered the glass. The glass touched the table with a soft sound that seemed louder than it should have been. Nathan Brooks stared at the waitress standing beside him, trying to decide whether this was a mistake, a misunderstanding, or something far stranger. Around them, the restaurant continued its quiet rhythm. A couple near the window discussed vacation homes in Aspen. A server polished silverware behind the bar. No one else appeared to notice the tension forming at table 14. Nathan studied Claire Bennett carefully now. Up close, she did not look nervous the way most people did when speaking to someone whose company employed thousands of people. Her posture was steady. Her eyes moved briefly across the room, then back to him, as if she were measuring something invisible. Nathan leaned slightly closer and lowered his voice. "Why would you say that?" Claire did not answer immediately. She placed the water pitcher from her tray gently on the table, as if she were simply refilling a glass during normal service. Her movements were slow and ordinary, but her attention remained fixed on the dining room behind him. Two men at the nearby table were still seated exactly where they had been moments earlier. One of them lifted a fork and continued eating as if nothing unusual had happened. The other checked his phone again. From a distance, they looked like businessmen finishing a late dinner. From closer observation, they were watching more than they were eating. Claire finally spoke in a calm voice barely louder than a whisper. Please set the glass down and do not drink it yet. Nathan felt a flicker of irritation rise inside him. He was used to people explaining themselves quickly when they interrupted him. Investors, executives, reporters. They all knew that if they took his time, they had better give him a clear reason. But something in Claire's expression stopped him from dismissing her immediately. She was not guessing. She was not afraid. She looked certain. Nathan glanced at the champagne again. Pale gold bubbles drifted slowly toward the surface of the crystal flute. It looked exactly the way champagne always looked. Clean, elegant, harmless. Yet Nathan noticed something strange inside himself. He had built a company worth billions by trusting instinct as much as data, and at that moment his instinct told him to wait. So he left the glass where it was. Across the room, Claire saw the smallest reaction from the men at the other table. One of them shifted in his chair slightly when Nathan lowered the drink. It was a movement most people would not have noticed. But Claire noticed everything. Nathan followed her gaze. Now he saw them too. Two men who had stopped speaking the moment the champagne returned to the table, who were suddenly very interested in their phones. Nathan turned back to Claire. His voice was quiet but direct. What exactly did you hear? Claire hesitated for only a second. Not because she doubted what she heard, but because she was deciding how much to say. Finally, she met his eyes again. I heard them mention your name. Nathan Brooks felt the air around the table grow heavier even though the room itself had not changed at all. The music still played softly. Glasses still clinked in quiet. Celebration. Yet suddenly the evening no longer felt ordinary. Nathan looked again at the untouched champagne in front of him. And for the first time since he entered the restaurant, he realized someone in this room might be paying very close attention to whether he drank it. Claire Bennett did not move away from the table. She stood there with the quiet patience of someone who understood that the next few seconds mattered more than the past few minutes. Nathan Brooks leaned back slightly in his chair, studying her face as if he were analyzing a difficult business proposal. He had met thousands of people during the rise of his company. Venture capitalists, politicians, analysts, competitors. Most of them revealed their intentions within the first few sentences. Claire revealed almost nothing. The only thing Nathan could see clearly was that she was not guessing. The certainty in her eyes was calm and deliberate, the way someone looked when they had already finished calculating the outcome. Nathan lowered his voice even further. You heard my name. From them. Claire nodded once, very slightly. Yes. Nathan glanced again toward the nearby table, without turning his head too obviously. The two men appeared relaxed, but their movements were controlled. One of them took a sip of water while pretending to read something on his phone. The other adjusted his jacket and looked briefly toward the bar. Neither of them looked at Nathan directly anymore, which somehow made Nathan feel even more observed. He turned his attention back to Claire. What exactly did they say? Claire rested the water pitcher on the tray again. Her voice remained quiet and steady. They were speaking in a language most people here would not recognize. But I understood enough to know they were discussing a drink and a timeline. Nathan felt his mind shift into the same mode it used during high-level negotiations. Calm, analytical, focused on details that other people overlooked. What timeline? Claire answered immediately. 5 minutes. Nathan looked at the champagne glass again. He had lifted it less than a minute earlier. The bubbles continued rising slowly inside the crystal flute as if nothing in the world had changed. He exhaled slowly through his nose. You are telling me two strangers mentioned my name and a drink with a 5-minute window, and you decided to interrupt my dinner. Claire met his gaze. Without hesitation. Yes. Nathan expected hesitation. Most people would have apologized by now or tried to soften their claim. Claire did neither. She simply waited. The restaurant lighting reflected softly in the polished floor while a jazz piano track drifted from hidden speakers above the bar. Everything about the room suggested comfort and luxury. Yet Nathan suddenly felt as if he had stepped into a conversation whose meaning had not fully revealed itself yet. Across the dining room, one of the two men shifted again. This time Nathan noticed something subtle. The man briefly glanced toward Nathan's table and then toward the champagne glass. It lasted less than a second. But it was enough. Nathan's attention sharpened instantly. He leaned forward slightly. How certain are you? Claire answered with a level voice that carried no drama, only precision. Certain enough that I would not let you drink that. Nathan Brooks had built a $10 billion company by trusting patterns that other people missed. At that moment, a pattern was beginning to form in his mind. Two men speaking quietly in a language few people understood. His name mentioned in passing. A reference to a drink and a timeline. And a waitress who noticed it all before anyone else in the room. Nathan slowly slid the champagne glass a few inches farther away from him. Then he looked back at Claire Bennett and asked the one question that mattered most. How do you understand a conversation like that in the first place? Claire Bennett did not answer immediately. The question hung quietly between them while the soft piano music from the corner of the restaurant continued its slow melody. Around them, servers carried plates, glasses clinked gently, and conversations drifted through the air like nothing unusual was happening. Yet at table 14, the atmosphere had shifted. Nathan Brooks watched her carefully. Most people filled silence with explanations. Claire seemed comfortable letting the silence exist. Finally she spoke, her voice calm and even. I studied languages in college. Nathan raised an eyebrow slightly. That was not the answer he expected. How many languages? Claire considered the question for a moment, as if the number itself was not very important. Enough to recognize when someone thinks they are speaking privately. Nathan leaned back in his chair, still studying her. He noticed details now that he had ignored earlier. The way she scanned the room without turning her head fully. The way her shoulders remained relaxed, even while discussing something that clearly involved risk. She did not behave like someone who had only carried trays for a living. Across the room, the two men remained seated at their table. One of them had signaled for the check. The other appeared to be scrolling through messages on his phone. They looked patient. Too patient. Nathan shifted his gaze back to the champagne glass sitting untouched in front of him. The bubbles had begun to fade slightly, the way champagne always did after a few minutes. He thought about the timing Claire mentioned. 5 minutes. How long had it been since he lifted the glass? 2 minutes perhaps. Maybe 3. Nathan lowered his voice further. What language were they speaking? Claire answered quietly. Russian. Nathan felt a small chill of recognition move through him. His company had recently entered negotiations involving a European technology acquisition. The deal had drawn attention from competitors across several markets, including some who had lost bids they very much wanted to win. Nathan tapped the table lightly with one finger, thinking through possibilities. You understood enough to hear my name. Claire nodded once. Yes. Nathan watched the nearby table again. One of the men stood up now and slipped his phone into his jacket pocket. The other followed a moment later. They did not hurry. They simply walked toward the exit with the smooth confidence of people leaving after an ordinary dinner. Claire noticed it at the same moment Nathan did. They are leaving, she said quietly. Nathan did not move. His mind was calculating the situation the way it always did during difficult decisions. If Claire was wrong, then he had just allowed a stranger to interrupt his evening over a misunderstanding. If she was right, then someone in this room had expected him to finish that champagne minutes ago. The two men reached the front door of the restaurant and stepped out into the Manhattan night. No one stopped them. No one even looked twice. Nathan stared at the empty space where they had been sitting only seconds earlier. Then he looked back at Claire Bennett. There was still one question he had not answered. Slowly he slid the champagne glass another inch away from his seat and spoke quietly. If they expected me to drink it by now, then something about their plan just failed. Claire met his eyes with the same calm certainty she had shown from the beginning. Yes, she said softly. It did. Nathan Brooks kept his eyes on the empty entrance for several seconds after the two men disappeared into the Manhattan night. The glass door closed softly behind them, and the restaurant returned to its quiet rhythm as if nothing unusual had happened. But at table 14 the atmosphere had changed completely. Nathan slowly turned his attention back to the champagne sitting in front of him. The pale gold liquid now looked different to him. Not because the glass had changed, but because the context around it had. He had built an empire by recognizing when small details meant larger patterns. And every instinct he had was telling him the same thing. Something about this situation was real. Nathan lifted his hand slightly and gestured toward the champagne. Do not touch it yet, he said quietly. Claire Bennett gave a small nod of understanding. She did not look surprised by the instruction. If anything, She seemed relieved that he had reached the same conclusion she had minutes earlier. Nathan glanced around the room once more. The restaurant was still full. Couples were enjoying dessert. Executives discussed numbers over wine, and a waiter laughed softly with a regular customer near the bar. None of them realized that a quiet decision had just taken place at one table among many. Nathan leaned forward and spoke in a tone that carried calm authority. "I need a manager, and I need him discreetly." Claire did not ask questions. She simply nodded once and walked away with the same smooth professionalism she had used since the beginning of the evening. Within 2 minutes, a middle-aged man in a dark suit approached the table. His name was Robert Langley, the restaurant manager who had overseen service in the establishment for nearly 15 years. He recognized Nathan immediately. "Mr. Brooks, is everything satisfactory this evening?" Nathan gestured toward the empty chair across from him. "Please sit for a moment, Robert." The manager hesitated briefly, surprised by the request, but he complied. Nathan lowered his voice. "I believe someone intended for this drink to reach me tonight." Robert blinked in confusion. "I am sorry, sir. I do not understand." Nathan turned the glass slowly so the light reflected across the surface of the champagne. "Neither did I 10 minutes ago." Then he glanced toward Claire, who had returned quietly and now stood a few steps behind the table. She heard a conversation that suggested otherwise. Robert looked from Nathan to Claire, clearly uncertain how to react. Nathan spoke calmly, the way he did during critical boardroom discussions. "I am not accusing your restaurant of anything, but I would like someone to examine this glass carefully before it goes anywhere near a dishwasher." Robert's expression slowly changed from confusion to concern. "Of course, Mr. Brooks." Nathan leaned back again in his chair as Robert carefully lifted the glass with a folded napkin and carried it toward the private service station behind the bar. Claire remained standing nearby, watching silently. A few minutes passed. The piano music continued drifting through the restaurant. Finally, Robert returned. His face looked different now, more serious. "Mr. Brooks," he said quietly, "our staff member who handles beverage safety believes there may indeed be something unusual in the drink." Nathan Brooks looked at Claire Bennett for a long moment. The quiet waitress who had spoken only a few words had just changed the entire course of his evening. And possibly something far more important. Robert Langley stood beside the table with a tension that had not been there earlier. The confident restaurant manager who had greeted guests with polished ease now carried the cautious focus of someone realizing the evening might hold consequences far beyond a normal dinner service. Nathan Brooks watched him carefully. Years of negotiating billion-dollar deals had trained Nathan to read the smallest changes in a person's expression. And Robert's expression told him something important. The concern was real. Nathan spoke quietly. "What exactly did your staff member find?" Robert lowered his voice to match Nathan's calm tone. "Our beverage specialist noticed a faint chemical scent that should not be present in champagne. It is subtle. Most people would never recognize it. But he asked that we secure the glass immediately and contact authorities for proper analysis." Nathan nodded slowly. The pieces of the situation were aligning in his mind with unsettling precision. He glanced briefly toward Claire Bennett, who still stood nearby with the same quiet composure she had shown from the beginning. She had not tried to claim credit. She had not even moved closer to the table. She simply watched the room as if making sure nothing else had changed. Nathan turned back to Robert. "Thank you for handling this carefully. I would prefer not to disturb the entire dining room tonight." Robert nodded. "Of course, Mr. Brooks. We will handle it discreetly." He excused himself and walked back toward the service station, already speaking quietly with another staff member. Nathan remained seated for a moment, absorbing the weight of what had just happened. 10 minutes earlier, he had walked into the restaurant expecting nothing more complicated than a quiet dinner after a long day of meetings. Now the untouched glass of champagne had become evidence of something far more serious. Nathan finally looked directly at Claire. "You may sit for a moment if you like," he said calmly. Claire hesitated slightly. Waitresses rarely sat at guest tables. But Nathan's tone carried the simple authority of someone who expected the invitation to be accepted. She pulled out the chair across from him and sat down carefully. For the first time since the evening began, they faced each other as two people sharing the same conversation rather than a server and a customer. Nathan studied her thoughtfully. Most people would have ignored a fragment of conversation in a foreign language. Most people would have assumed they misunderstood. "You did not." Claire answered simply. I have learned that certain words always matter. Nathan folded his hands on the table. Your timing was precise. Claire nodded slightly. They mentioned 5 minutes. I believe that meant the drink would be consumed within that time. Nathan glanced again toward the empty table where the two men had been sitting earlier. The chairs were now occupied by a new couple who had no idea what had unfolded their minutes before. The world had already moved on. But Nathan Brooks knew something important had shifted tonight. He looked back at Claire Bennett with a level gaze. Then he asked quietly, "Tell me something honestly. When you heard them speaking earlier, did you know you might be stepping into something dangerous by warning me?" Claire held his gaze calmly. "Yes." Nathan exhaled slowly. "And you said something anyway." Claire gave a small nod. "Yes," she said softly. "Because sometimes the quietest decision changes everything." Nathan Brooks remained seated across from Claire Bennett while the quiet music continued drifting through the restaurant. The world around them had returned to its comfortable rhythm, but Nathan felt as if he were observing it from a different perspective now. 10 minutes earlier, every conversation in the room had sounded ordinary. Now he listened differently. Every voice, every movement, every glance seemed to carry hidden meaning. He rested his hands lightly on the table and studied Claire with the focused attention he usually reserved for executives presenting billion-dollar proposals. "You recognize the language immediately," he said calmly. Claire nodded. "Yes." Nathan leaned slightly forward. "Russian is not a language most people learn casually." Claire gave a small, thoughtful pause before answering. "Some people study languages because they enjoy culture. Others study them because they need to understand what people say when they believe no one is listening." Nathan watched her carefully. That answer revealed just enough truth to raise a much larger question. What kind of life teaches someone to think that way? Across the restaurant, Robert Langley continued speaking quietly with staff members near the service station. Nathan noticed a man in a dark suit entering through the front door and approaching the manager. The conversation between them remained calm and discreet, but Nathan recognized the professional posture immediately. Someone had already contacted security. Nathan turned his attention back to Claire. "Earlier you said you studied languages in college." Claire nodded once. "That is true." Nathan tilted his head slightly. "But that is not the entire story." Claire did not react defensively. Instead, she gave a faint smile that suggested Nathan's observation was accurate. "Most stories are longer than the first sentence people hear." Nathan allowed a small breath of amusement to escape him. "That is one of the most honest statements I have heard tonight." Claire glanced briefly toward the entrance where the security professional now stood speaking quietly with Robert. When she looked back at Nathan, her expression remained calm, but thoughtful. "The important thing is that you did not drink the champagne." Nathan followed her gaze for a moment before returning his attention to her. "That may have been the most important detail of my evening." Claire folded her hands lightly in front of her. "Sometimes a small decision changes a larger outcome." Nathan nodded slowly. His company had grown from a small office with 3 employees to a global enterprise precisely because he believed that principle. Small decisions created large consequences. And tonight a waitress had made one of those decisions on his behalf. Nathan leaned back slightly in his chair and spoke in a thoughtful tone. "You realized what might happen. You knew speaking up could draw attention you did not want. Yet you chose to say something anyway." Claire did not look away. "Yes." Nathan studied her face for another moment. Then he asked quietly, "Tell me something honestly, Claire Bennett. Were you trained to notice conversations like that?" Claire held his gaze for a long second before answering. "Yes," she said softly. "I was." Claire Bennett did not look surprised by Nathan's question. In fact, she looked as if she had expected it from the moment he lowered the champagne glass. The soft piano music continued drifting across the restaurant while waiters carried dessert plates past their table, completely unaware that a quiet conversation was revealing something far more unusual than anything printed on the menu. Claire rested her hands lightly together and spoke in a steady voice. "A long time ago, I worked in a place where listening carefully was part of the job." Nathan Brooks watched her without interrupting. His instincts told him not to rush this moment. People revealed important truths slowly when they felt no pressure. Claire continued after a brief pause. "It was mostly language work. Translating conversations. Recognizing patterns. Identifying when someone said one thing but meant something else entirely." Nathan nodded slightly. That explained more than her calm reaction earlier. It explained the way she scanned the room without appearing obvious. It explained the certainty in her voice when she asked him to set the glass down. Those were habits learned in environments where details mattered more than appearances. Nathan leaned forward slightly. Government work. Claire gave a faint smile that was neither confirmation nor denial. Something like that. Nathan exhaled softly. He had spent years negotiating contracts with international firms and government agencies. He recognized the careful wording immediately. Claire had answered his question without truly answering it. But she had told him enough to understand the important part. She had not been guessing earlier. Across the restaurant, the man in the dark suit who had spoken with Robert now walked calmly toward their table. He stopped beside Nathan and introduced himself quietly as part of the building's private security team. Mr. Brooks, the manager informed us that there may have been a concern regarding a beverage. Nathan nodded. It appears the concern was valid. The security professional glanced briefly toward Claire with respectful curiosity before returning his attention to Nathan. We will handle the situation carefully and review the surveillance cameras near the entrance. Nathan appreciated the professional tone. Calm, efficient, discreet. Exactly how a situation like this should be handled. Thank you, Nathan said. The man nodded and walked back toward the front of the restaurant. Claire watched him go before turning her attention back to Nathan. It seems the situation is already being managed. Nathan studied her again. That may be true, but something still interests me. Claire raised an eyebrow slightly. What is that? Nathan rested his hands together on the table. You recognized a threat that most people in this room would never notice. You understood a conversation spoken in a language very few guests here would recognize. And yet tonight you were working as a waitress in a Manhattan restaurant. Claire looked at him quietly for a moment before answering. Sometimes people choose quiet places after living in very loud ones. Nathan considered that sentence carefully. It sounded simple on the surface, but it carried the weight of experience behind it. He nodded slowly. That makes sense. Claire gave a small, polite smile. I prefer environments where people underestimate me. Nathan Brooks leaned back slightly in his chair, the thought settling clearly in his mind. Tonight, the most observant person in the entire restaurant had been the one no one was paying attention to. And because of that, he was still sitting there speaking with her instead of finishing a glass of champagne minutes earlier. The restaurant slowly returned to the comfortable rhythm it had before the interruption, yet Nathan Brooks knew the evening would never feel ordinary again. The untouched champagne glass had already been removed for examination. The security team had quietly reviewed the entrance cameras, and the two men who had left minutes earlier were now only faint images on a screen somewhere in the building's back office. But the most important detail of the entire situation still sat across the table from him. Claire Bennett adjusted the edge of the folded napkin beside her plate before standing slowly. Her shift was not finished, and she clearly had no intention of turning the moment into anything dramatic. I should return to my section, she said calmly. Other guests are waiting. Nathan nodded, understanding immediately. For Claire, the evening had never been about recognition or attention. It had been about a decision made quietly at exactly the right moment. As she stepped away from the table, Nathan spoke again. Claire. She paused and turned slightly. Nathan studied her for a moment with the same thoughtful expression he used when evaluating someone whose abilities were rare. You noticed something that every security system in this building missed. Claire answered simply. Sometimes the most important signals are the ones technology cannot hear. Nathan gave a small smile. That sounded like the conclusion of a lesson learned over many years. Claire picked up her tray again and prepared to continue working. Before she moved away, Nathan reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and placed a simple business card on the table. If you ever decide you would rather use those skills somewhere else, call me. Claire looked down at the card for a moment. It carried Nathan's private contact number beneath the name of his company, a corporation that employed thousands of people across several continents. For a brief second, she seemed to consider it. Then she placed the card back on the table in front of him. Thank you, Mr. Brooks. But I am comfortable where I am right now. Nathan raised an eyebrow slightly, impressed rather than offended. Most people would have accepted the offer instantly. Claire continued in the same calm tone she had used all evening. In places like this, people rarely notice who is listening. Nathan leaned back in his chair, realizing the deeper meaning behind her words. The world was full of rooms where powerful people spoke freely because they believed the quietest person in the room did not matter. Tonight had proven exactly how wrong that assumption could be. Claire gave him one final polite nod before walking away to deliver a dessert plate to another table across the dining room. Within seconds, she blended naturally back into the flow of service, just another waitress moving between conversations and candlelight. Nathan Brooks remained seated for a moment longer, watching the room with a new awareness. The evening had begun as a simple dinner after a long day of business decisions. It ended as a reminder he would not forget. Sometimes the most extraordinary person in the room is the one things to look at. And sometimes the quietest voice is the one that saves everything. A quiet dinner in a Manhattan restaurant turns into one of the most unexpected touching stories when a powerful millionaire is about to take a sip of champagne and a calm waitress quietly asks him to stop. What begins as a simple warning slowly reveals a deeper moment of human intuition, intelligence, and dignity as the millionaire realizes that the waitress noticed a subtle conversation in a foreign language that no one else in the room understood. As the evening unfolds, the millionaire begins to see that the woman serving tables possesses extraordinary awareness and discipline developed from a life where listening carefully could change outcomes. This cinematic narrative blends suspense and empathy in the spirit of truly touching stories, showing how a single quiet decision can redirect the course of an evening and possibly a life. The story follows the interaction between a confident millionaire used to controlling every business negotiation and a humble waitress who remains composed, observant, and unexpectedly insightful. As security reviews the situation and the mystery around the drink becomes clearer, the millionaire starts to understand that the person who protected him was not a bodyguard or an executive, but a waitress who simply refused to ignore what she heard. Moments like this define the heart of touching stories where courage does not appear loudly, but arrives through calm judgment and integrity. The millionaire attempts to reward the waitress for her awareness, but she politely declines, reminding him that sometimes the most capable people prefer quiet places where others underestimate them. Through subtle dialogue and emotional reflection, the encounter transforms into one of those unforgettable touching stories that reveal how respect is earned not through power but through character. By the end of the night, the millionaire leaves the restaurant with a new understanding that the world is full of extraordinary individuals hidden behind ordinary roles, making this encounter one more example of touching stories that remind us the quietest voices can carry the greatest impact, and that touching stories often begin with a moment no one else notices. Character 1. White American millionaire CEO, about 38 years old, sharp tailored dark navy business suit, crisp white shirt, confident composed expression, clean haircut, light skin tone, standing in elegant Manhattan restaurant, front-facing camera angle, cinematic realism, professional lighting. No cartoon, no CGI, no illustration. Character 2. White American waitress about 28 years old, light skin, soft intelligent eyes, calm composed face, neat ponytail, simple black restaurant server uniform with white shirt and apron, standing in elegant Manhattan restaurant, front-facing camera angle, cinematic realism, no cartoon, no CGI, no illustration.